just come through with this wonderful tone, just sets us up beautifully for our speaker today. So I get to introduce our speaker today. She is a TEDx speaker, a storyteller, podcaster, and an author. And as you heard Karen say yesterday, we had her host over here a beautiful retreat called Navigating Loss. But today she gets to be with us. So after living across the country, she now calls the Black Mountains of North Carolina home, although her work calls her to travel extensively. Her podcast is called Big Girl Pants. I like that. Put on your big girl pants and step up. I love that. All right. So if you want to learn more about it, you can please sign up to receive a free newsletter from DonnaMarieTodd.com. But for right here, right now, I'd like to welcome up our guest speaker, Donna Marie Todd.
Well, thank you so much. It is so beautiful in Hawaii. I cannot even believe how beautiful it is. It's very pretty where I'm from, too. And after meeting all the wonderful women at the retreat yesterday, I wanted to introduce you today to another woman that I met about, I guess, 15 years ago. Her name was Peaches. And Peaches had a philosophy that you should always treat others as you would like to be treated. She believed in the golden rule. Now, Peaches lived in a walk-up, one-room efficiency apartment. And when she would wake up every day, she'd yawn and stretch. And then she'd pull on her worn chenille robe, slide her feet into her fuzzy pink house slippers, and shuffle over to her stove to put the kettle on for tea. You see, constant comment tea was one of the few luxuries Peaches allowed herself. Constant comment tea and Pond's cold cream was the other. Well, she would get her cup of tea and she would make a piece of buttered toast and she would sit down in her rocking chair and she would read her Bible and she would pray and she would prepare for her day. And when she finished all of that, she would go into her bathroom and she'd pull the chain that lit the light that sat over that little metal medicine cabinet. And now the globe to that light was a seashell. It was her one and only souvenir from her one and only time to go to the beach. And every morning when the light shone through that shell, she could feel the sun on her face. She could see the birds flying in the sky, calling to one another. She could feel the hot sand up under her feet and the ocean waves lapping at her toes. Ooh, that had been so much fun. She was going to do that again someday. And then with the slow, steady hands born of a simple lifestyle, Peaches would take her jar of Pond's cold cream and she would cleanse her face. She'd put it on her forehead. She'd put it around her eyes, her nose, her mouth, and then she'd take it off. From around her nose and her mouth. And then she'd smile at herself in the mirror because she sure did have pretty skin. That's why her mother named her Peaches. She had such pretty skin. And then she'd get dressed for work. She went to work every day, 6 days a week. And so she would go in and pull on her thick white cotton hose. Then she'd slide on her slip. And then she would put on her pink uniform that had the white stand-up cuffs and the white collar, had her name embroidered right there on it, Peaches. And then she'd put on her heavy white shoes, you know, the kind that nurses wear. Peaches had always wanted to be a nurse and help people, but that hadn't been meant to be. And so when God had given her the job that he gave her to do, which was being a lunch counter waitress, well, she just decided right then and there that if that's what the Spirit wanted her to do, well, she was going to be the best lunch counter waitress in the whole country. I mean, the mainland. And she was, too. And then she'd lock the door to her little apartment. She'd walk down the steps. And she'd walk the 3 blocks that way to the McCrory 5 and Dime, where she was the waitress at the lunch counter. And she'd walk along singing her sweet songs the whole way. If the Lord from you withhold all his silver and his gold, and you have to get along with meager fare, just remember in his word how he feeds the little bird. Take your burden to the Lord and leave it there. Leave it there, oh, leave it there. Take your burden to the Lord and leave it there. If you trust and never doubt, he will surely help you out. Take your burden to the Lord and leave it there. Oh, take your burden to the Lord and leave it there. Woo! Yeah, now on Mondays, she would stop at the flower stand at the corner of Market and Main, and she would pick up a little bouquet, what was on sale after the weekend. Now, sometimes it was daisies, sometimes it was mums, sometimes it was her favorite, pink button carnations. She'd buy that bouquet of flowers and take it on down to the 5 and Dime, because, see, the flowers were not for Peaches. No, they were for her customers, you understand? And when she got there, she'd put them in them little blue vases that she'd bought that year at the after Christmas, it's so far after Christmas, it's Valentine's Day sale, for 50% off plus her 25% employee discount. And she would put them little vases on the counter every week just for her customers to enjoy. Because you should do unto others as you would want others to do unto you, right? Well, now, first thing, when she got there, she'd flip on the lights. She was always the first one there. And she'd see all them little creepy crawlies crawling across the counter. So first thing she did was fill up a big bucket of hot soapy water, pull on her long yeller gloves, and then she'd wash down that counter. Well, now, just about the time she got finished washing down that counter, why, Cook would show up, hung over from the night before. And he'd come in the door and swing his big old beer belly up on that pass-through, you know, from the kitchen to the counter, and he'd say, "What are you doing that for? I already done it last night." And Peaches would say, "Yeah." And that was before all the little creepy crawlies come out. To tell you the truth, I think Cook was a little afraid of Peaches, given that she knew he was always late to work, and she knew he had that little bottle in his pocket just to make it through the day, you know. Well, anyway, once she finished washing down the counter, then she'd pull off her long rubber gloves, dump out the water, and then she'd make the first pot of coffee of the day for her customers. And when Cook wasn't looking, she'd put an extra scoop of coffee in that first pot, because that's the way Bill Boyette liked it. Bill Boyette, he was a widower, owned the tire store down to the other end of town. Oh, he was a tall, lean, cool drink of a man. Sad eyes like a hound dog. And she had the biggest crush on him. Well, Bill would come in every morning and he'd swing one of his long legs up on that lunch counter stool and pull himself up to the counter. And she'd grab the menu and take it over there, even though she already knew what he was going to have. And she'd say, well, Bill, good morning. Can I get you a cup of coffee? And Bill'd say, well, if it's strong enough. Peaches would say, well, I reckon we'll just have to see if you like it or not. And she'd bring him a cup of that strong coffee. It was strong enough to get in the cup by itself. And he would take a sip of it and he'd say, Peaches, you sure do know how to make a cup of coffee. And then she'd take out her little notepad and her pencil and she'd say, well, Bill, do you know what you want today? Like she didn't know what he'd have that day. And he'd look at the menu like he'd never seen it before. and he'd say, "Well, I reckon today I'll have the blue plate special." And she'd write it down like she'd never heard him say it before, blue plate special. And she'd say, "Well, now, how you want your eggs, Bill?" And he'd say, "Well, let me think. I guess today I'll have them sunny side up," like he ever had them any other way. And she'd write down, 2 eggs, sunny side up. And then she'd take that order and she'd slap it up on the counter there for Cook, and she'd say, "Blue plate special, 2 eggs, sunny side up." And Cook, he'd whip that old beer belly up onto that counter and he'd say, "I ain't got no time for no special order eggs." And Peaches would say, "Well, you make time." And every day, that blue plate special would come up on that counter with 2 eggs sunny side up. Well, then they'd talk about the weather, maybe the ball game at the high school that weekend or something. And then when he was finished with breakfast, why, Bill would reach down into his pocket and he'd pull out 2 quarters and he'd slide them across the counter to Peaches. And he'd say, "Well, Peaches, I may see you tomorrow." She'd say, "Well, I'll see you when I see you." Now, Peaches took care of people because it's right to do unto others as you want others to do unto you. Like one day, there were these 2 little girls. They come running in the store, and their mama wasn't paying them no mind. She was a scrawny-looking woman, went rumbling through the hairbrushes. And those 2 little girls, they run up to the counter, and they had just finished the breakfast service. And there was such a hunger in their eyes. Well, Peaches, she motioned them to come on up and sit down on one of the stools there. And then she took that 50 cents out of her pocket and she slid it into the cash register. And she filled up a plate of scrambled eggs and pancakes and bacon, everything that was left over from the service that day at breakfast, and she gave it to those 2 little girls. She poured them each a big glass of cold milk. And by the time she gave them the second glass of milk, they were finished with everything but the bacon. They ate that bacon like they had never tasted anything so fine. And then they just hopped down and ran back to their mama, didn't say thank you or nothing. But Peaches didn't pay them no mind for that because it was right to do unto others as you'd have others do unto you. And Peaches knew what it was like to be hungry, see. Peaches was 4 when her daddy'd run off, leaving her and her mama to get along on their own. And a lot of times after her mama got that job down to the 5 and Dime, being the waitress down there, there wasn't anything to eat. And so at night they'd sit in the bed and they'd curl up next to each other and they'd pretend that they had a fairy godmother and that she lived in a great big house and had all kinds of fancy food. And Peaches' mom would say, "Look there, Peaches. See that pretty tablecloth?" And Peaches would snuggle up against her mama and she'd say, "Yeah, Mama, I see it. And I see that great big old meatloaf at the end of the table." Peaches' mom would say, "Yeah, honey. And look, there's a big bowl of mashed potatoes." Peach would say, "Yeah, Mama. And there's rolls, too, and a great big frosted cake." And then they go to sleep. Her mama singing one of her favorite songs to Peaches as they fell asleep. "Leanin', leanin', leanin' on the everlasting arms, leanin', oh, leanin', leanin' on the everlasting arms." Well, Peaches worked real hard in school. She was a good student. She wanted to be a nurse. She was 16 years old when one night her mama came home from the lunch counter on a Friday saying she didn't feel very good. She wouldn't eat anything, threw up all night. And the next day she was crying in bed, sweating and holding her belly. And then by Sunday, Peach's mama was dead. And they come and they took her away, and then the manager of the 5 and Dime, he come to give Peaches the final wages for her mama. And when he realized that she was there by herself, that she didn't have a daddy, he said he'd have to call the DHS, and she'd have to go to an orphanage. And Peaches, she begged him not to do that. She begged him to let her have her mama's job down there. I mean, she was 16 years old. It was the mountains. People worked when they were 16 back then. So he finally relented and said she could have that lunch counter job just as a trial, just to see how she did. And that was when Peaches became a lunch counter waitress. And when God gave her that job to do, why, she took it serious. She took it as serious as anything. Even though she wanted to be a nurse and take care of people, Peaches took what God gave her to do, and she turned that into her mission, you see. Now, on Wednesdays, she took care of old Miss Thomas. Miss Thomas was strange. She always wore the same thing every day, a big floppy flowered hat and a tan raincoat and red kids' tennis shoes, just like kids, like a kid would wear. And old Miss Thomas, she'd come in there and she'd rattle around in the pantyhose. She'd stretch them out, see if they had any runners in them. And then she'd go over to the perfume and she'd open it up and sniff it. And when she found one she liked, and nobody was looking, she'd test drive it. And then she'd come over to the counter and she'd order the same thing every Wednesday, potato soup with extra crackers. And Peaches would give her the soup, and she'd ask Miss Thomas what perfume she favored. And Miss Thomas would say, don't like any of them, they all smell cheap. But Peaches noticed that when Miss Thomas opened her wallet to pay for her potato soup, she didn't have any money in there for perfume. And Peaches wasn't judging her for that, because Peaches didn't have money for perfume neither. But she did have money for potatoes. And so she'd reach down into her pocket and she'd slide that 50-cent bill giver into the cash register. And then she'd fill up another big bowl of soup and get a big handful of crackers and tell Miss Thomas that refills was free on Wednesdays. Do unto others as you'd have others do unto you. Well, then the day came when Peaches was just too old to work anymore. The state said she couldn't do it. She was 72 years old when she retired. And I guess, given how she took care of people her whole life, it shouldn't come as any surprise to you that when she retired, she went into full-time service to the Holy Spirit. She still got up every day, still drank her constant comment tea, still used her Pond's cold cream to clean her face. She still pulled on her heavy white cotton hose. And she still put on a slip and a uniform, only this time the uniform was gray. Because she was a gray lady, a volunteer, see? And then she'd put on her white shoes, the ones like nurses wear. And she'd leave the apartment and lock the door, walk down the steps. But instead of walking that way to the Five and Dime, she would walk another 3 blocks the other way to the hospice hospital. And that's where I met Peaches. Because you see, my mother had lost her 43-year victory over breast cancer. And she was there in that hospital, dying. And every morning when I would get there, Peaches was already there, holding Mama's hand, reading to her from the Bible, talking about life and death. And on the day my mother died, I was so filled with sorrow and grief that I said to Peaches, how can you do this every day? How can you come down here and stay with people who are unconscious, people who are dying, people who are in pain? And she patted my hand and she said, oh, now, honey, everybody dies, honey. Now, some people, like your sweet mama here, they already know that they're one with everything, that God is taking care of them. But honey, when they bring you here, you know you're coming here to die. And can you imagine coming here to die and not knowing that God loves you? And I said, no, Peaches, I can't. And she grinned real big and she said, yeah, me neither. And that's what me and God calls an opportunity. And with that, she ran out into the hallway. And all day long, I'd hear her little white shoes squeaking up and down the hall, going into people's rooms, calling them by name, holding their hand, and telling them that they was going to be okay, because they was really one with everything and that God loved them. She'd sing them a sweet, sweet song as they passed on. Precious Lord, take my hand, lead me on, help me stand. I am tired, I am weak, I am worn. Through the storm, through the night, lead me on to the light. Precious Lord, take my hand, lead me home. If Peaches was here today, she'd want you to remember that you're one with everything. She'd want you to remember that all God asks you to do every day of your life is to love others the way that you would like to be loved. Amen.